December 1942, the skies over New Guinea witnessed a turning point. Japanese pilots laughed at the strange American planes with twin tails, believing the Zero was unbeatable. But within minutes, the laughter was gone. A farm boy from Wisconsin, flying the P-38 Lightning, proved that air combat would never be the same. From that day on, the skies no longer belonged to Japan. December 27, 1942. Port Moresby, New Guinea. The jungle still clung to the night as the first streaks of sunlight broke over the Owen Stanley Range. At Lockheed Airfield, the steel matting runway glistened with dew, stretching like a scar carved into the tropical earth. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of oil, sweat, and damp vegetation. Ground crews, bone-tired from weeks of endless work, pulled away the camouflage netting that hid 12 odd-looking aircraft. To the untrained eye, they seemed almost alien, sleek, twin-boomed silhouettes with two tails jutting skyward. For the men who worked on them, however, they were familiar machines. Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, the pride of the 39th Fighter Squadron, 35th Fighter Group. Each fighter sat, fueled and armed, their canopies fogged from the night's humidity. Ammunition belts had been carefully fed into nose-mounted guns, 4 heavy .50 caliber Brownings and 1 20mm cannon. The men had learned that every round counted out here in the South Pacific, where supplies came by ship across thousands of miles of ocean. Nearby, Captain Thomas Lynch adjusted his flight helmet and scanned the horizon. At his side, a young lieutenant named Richard Bong, just 22 years old, fresh-faced and broad-shouldered from Wisconsin farm life, checked his gauges with quiet determination. Bong was only temporarily attached to the unit, waiting for his own squadron's Lightnings to arrive. But today, fate had handed him a front-row seat in what was about to become a turning point in the Pacific Air War. Suddenly, a jeep tore across the field, raising a trail of red dust. A Coast Watcher's intelligence report had just arrived by radio. Major Japanese air raid developing. Multiple formations approaching Buna. Estimated 40 aircraft. Fighter escort confirmed. Time to intercept, 30 minutes. The words hit like a thunderclap. Mechanics worked faster, pulling chocks, slamming hatches, shouting over the rising roar of engines. The P-38's twin Allison V-1710s came alive with a deep-throated growl, exhaust flames flickering blue against the dawn. For months, Allied pilots had struggled against the legendary Mitsubishi Zero. In the cockpits of P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks, they had fought, bled, and died, too often learning that a turning fight with a Zero meant suicide. Japanese pilots, seasoned from China and Pearl Harbor, flew with supreme confidence. They ruled the horizontal battlefield, where agility and maneuver decided life or death. But this morning was different. Yes, this morning, something new was about to rise into the skies over New Guinea. Captain Lynch gave a hand signal, throttled forward, and his Lightning surged down the runway. One after another, the 12 strange twin-tailed fighters followed, wheels leaving steel, wings biting into the humid air. From above, they must have looked like silver arrows leaping into the sun. As the squadron climbed through the morning haze, none of the men could have known that they were minutes away from rewriting the rules of air combat. The Japanese formation, confident and routine in its mission, was flying straight into a storm they could not yet comprehend. For the men of the 39th Squadron, it was just another mission. For the Japanese pilots racing toward Buna, it was about to be the day laughter turned into shock. High above the steaming jungles of New Guinea, the Imperial Japanese Navy's fighter pilots settled into their escort formations. Their Mitsubishi A6M Zeros glistened in the morning light, white paint schemes streaked with battle scars from a year of victories. Alongside them flew Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars and Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, the elite of Japan's air arm, hardened by 13 months of uninterrupted triumph. Inside the cockpits, the pilots were calm, even casual. For over a year they had ruled the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies. Their Zero was unmatched, fast enough, agile enough, and so maneuverable it could outturn anything the Americans or British put into the air. Allied pilots had learned this the hard way. Once a Zero got onto your tail, escape was nearly impossible. The numbers told the story. The Zero could climb to 6,000 feet in under 8 minutes, turn inside nearly every opponent, and hit speeds over 330 miles per hour. By contrast, American P-40s and P-39s were heavy, sluggish, and prone to stall at altitude. Japanese pilots had grown accustomed to circling above their enemies like hawks, confident in their ability to dictate the fight. This morning, the mission seemed routine. Protect the dive bombers on their way to Buna. Drive away whatever few Allied fighters showed up. Return to base in time for rice and tea. One veteran, Lieutenant Kenji Sato, allowed himself a grin as he scanned the horizon. His wingman, a younger pilot, pointed toward a faint glint in the distance. "There, sir. 12 of them." Sato squinted. The silhouettes climbing from Port Moresby looked odd. Twin fuselages, 2 tails, not the familiar single-engine shapes they were used to. For weeks, Japanese intelligence officers had mentioned rumors of a new American aircraft. Some said it was a bomber, others claimed it was a reconnaissance plane. None of them took it seriously. "Clumsy machines," Sato chuckled over the radio. "The Americans must be desperate to send such heavy birds against us." Laughter crackled in reply from other cockpits. To them, the strange twin-boomed fighters looked slow, awkward, and vulnerable. But Sato's grin masked a deeper confidence. He and his comrades had reason to laugh. The Zero had humiliated every new enemy thrown at it so far. British Spitfires in Malaya, Dutch fighters in the East Indies, American P-40s in the Philippines. None had lasted long against the disciplined, experienced Japanese airmen. For the pilots of the Imperial Navy, air combat was not just skill, but tradition, a matter of honor. They had been trained to believe in the Zero's near-mystical agility and their own mastery of the turning fight. Against these ungainly American machines, what could possibly go wrong? As the formations closed the distance, the Japanese relaxed into their familiar escort patterns. Bombers droned steadily ahead, fighters weaving protective arcs above. The sky was theirs, just as it had always been. What they did not know, what they could not yet imagine, was that the battlefield had shifted beneath their very wings. The Americans climbing toward them carried something entirely new, a weapon born not of tradition, but of speed, altitude, and firepower. In minutes, the confidence of Japan's finest pilots would shatter. Their laughter, so easy and mocking, would turn into disbelief. The war in the air was about to change forever. Far from the steaming jungles of New Guinea, the story of America's most famous ace began in the cold fields of Wisconsin. Richard Ira Bong was born in 1920, the son of a Swedish immigrant farmer near the small town of Poplar. Life there was simple and demanding. He milked cows before dawn, mended fences, and worked the land with the quiet discipline that Midwestern farm life instilled in every child. But Bong had a fascination that set him apart. On clear nights, he would lie in the grass and stare at the stars, tracing the paths of airplanes that occasionally droned overhead. When the civilian pilot training program came to Wisconsin in 1939, he signed up immediately. His natural skill was obvious from the beginning. Instructors noted how calm he remained in the cockpit, how smoothly he handled the stick, how instinctively he read the sky. By 1941, as war loomed, Bong was training at Hamilton Field in California. There he was introduced to the P-38 Lightning. Unlike the single-engine fighters most cadets preferred, the Lightning was a beast, long, heavy, and utterly different in appearance. 2 engines, twin tails, and a cockpit perched between them. Some pilots found it awkward. Bong studied it like a farm boy studying a new tractor, carefully, patiently. determined to understand every lever and switch. He absorbed the tactical lessons drilled into him by instructors. The P-38 was not built to turn with an enemy. It was built to strike from above, diving with blistering speed, unleashing its concentrated firepower, and then climbing back to altitude. To fight like this required discipline, the very kind Bong had grown up with. Where others grew impatient and tried to dogfight like in the old days, Bong trusted the numbers, speed, altitude, and firepower. Life at Hamilton Field had small touches of home. On weekends, he'd write letters to his family, describing his flights and the new world of California. He and other young men bought Coca-Cola from vending machines, listened to swing music on the radio, and teased each other about girlfriends back home. Yet beneath the laughter lay the knowledge that soon they would be fighting for their lives against a ruthless enemy. By late 1942, Bong had shipped out to the South Pacific. The war was no longer an abstract idea. It was real, immediate, and deadly. That December morning at Lockheed Airfield, when he strapped into his P-38 alongside Captain Lynch, he carried with him not only the hopes of his family back in Wisconsin, but also the quiet determination of a young man who believed in preparation, patience, and faith in his machine. As he checked his gauges and adjusted his oxygen mask, he thought of the lessons hammered into him. Don't turn with a zero. Don't fight on their terms. Strike fast, strike hard, climb away. He didn't know it yet, but within minutes, those lessons would be tested. And in that test, Richard Bong would claim his very first victories, opening a path that would make him America's top ace of the war. The farm boy from Wisconsin was about to step into history. At 18,000 feet, the two formations finally saw each other clearly. To the Japanese, the American planes still looked awkward, ungainly machines with twin tails. To Captain Thomas Lynch and his men, they looked like the opportunity to rewrite the rules of the Pacific Air War. Lynch pushed his throttles forward, and the twin Allison engines of his P-38 Lightning screamed in response. He nosed the fighter down into a dive that quickly pushed past 400 miles per hour. The controls grew heavy, the jungle canopy rushing upward, but the Lightning held steady. Behind him, 12 silver arrows followed, slicing into the Japanese formation from above. The Japanese escort fighters reacted with the instincts that had made them dominant for so long. They tried to turn into the attack, swinging their agile Zeros and Oscars into tight circles. But this was not the horizontal battlefield they had trained for. Lynch opened fire first. From the Lightning's nose erupted a stream of destruction. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all firing straight ahead, perfectly aligned. The target, a Ki-43 Oscar, never stood a chance. The Japanese fighter disintegrated in a shower of fragments before its pilot could react. From his cockpit, Richard Bong tightened his grip on the trigger. He had drilled for this moment in California, and now the farm boy from Wisconsin was about to test himself. Spotting a Zero breaking away to chase Lynch, Bong rolled his P-38 into position. He led the target, aimed just ahead of its nose, and squeezed the trigger. The Lightning shuddered as 5 guns opened fire. Tracer rounds arced into the morning sky, and the Zero suddenly burst into flames, spiraling downward in a trail of black smoke. Bong's heart raced, his first confirmed kill. He barely had time to process it before 3 more Zeros dropped onto his tail. For a split second, Bong's instincts screamed at him to turn and fight, but he remembered the words drilled into him. Don't turn with a Zero. Use your speed. Use your climb. He shoved the throttles forward. The Lightning responded like a wild horse, surging ahead. Bong nosed down and the airspeed needle leapt past 450 miles per hour. The Zeros followed, but their wings began to shudder violently. At that speed, their airframes risked tearing apart. Bong pulled away easily, leaving them struggling behind. At the same time, other Lightnings tore through the bomber formation. The concentrated firepower of their nose-mounted guns allowed American pilots to open fire from nearly twice the range the Japanese were used to. Dive bombers exploded in mid-air. One Val disintegrated under Lynch's guns, another tumbled into the jungle, trailing fire. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. By the end, Japanese pilots were stunned. They had been trained to rule the skies with turning fights, close-quarters duels where agility was everything. But against the P-38, none of it mattered. The Americans refused to fight their way. They dove, struck like lightning, and climbed back into the clouds before the Japanese could react. As Bong pulled his Lightning back to altitude, his adrenaline still surging, he looked down at the smoking wrecks below. 2 kills to his name already, and countless more to come. The squadron had destroyed more than a dozen enemy aircraft without losing a single Lightning. For the Japanese, it was the first glimpse of a nightmare. The air war had shifted. The battlefield was no longer flat and predictable. It had become vertical, and in that vertical world, the Zero was suddenly helpless. For the Japanese pilots who survived that first clash, the sky had suddenly turned into a nightmare. Lieutenant Kenji Sato, who only minutes before had been chuckling about the clumsy American machines, now found himself shoving his Zero stick forward in a desperate dive. The P-38 that had torn through his formation had vanished downward like a silver arrow, impossible to match. Sato's Zero picked up speed, 330 miles per hour, 360, 380. The controls grew stiff, the airframe began to tremble, and warning whistles shrieked in the cockpit. At 400 miles per hour, the Zero threatened to tear itself apart. Sato pulled back, fighting the stick with both hands. Sweat streamed down his face. Ahead of him, the American Lightning simply kept going, smooth and steady, climbing back toward the clouds, as if gravity itself no longer applied. Other Japanese pilots were experiencing the same shock. Zeros that had once seemed untouchable in dogfights suddenly looked fragile, their legendary agility meaningless against an enemy that refused to turn. For more than a year, their combat doctrine had been built on tight maneuvers and close-range gunnery. Now they were being attacked from distances where their 7.7mm machine guns and 20mm cannons couldn't even reach. One pilot later wrote in his diary, "We could not even get close enough to fire. They struck us from afar, vanished, and returned from above. It was like fighting ghosts." Inside their cockpits, the disbelief was almost physical. The Zero's great strengths, its light weight, its ability to outturn anything in the sky, had suddenly become weaknesses. At high speeds, the thin wings shuddered violently. In dives, control surfaces locked up. In climbs, the single engine gasped for air, while the twin-engined Lightning shot upward with turbocharged power. From the American perspective, the difference was night and day. Pilots like Richard Bong were discovering just how devastating their machines could be when used properly. Bong himself had escaped 3 Zeros by simply diving away, something that would have been unthinkable in the older P-40s or P-39s. For the Japanese, the shock went deeper than the loss of aircraft. It was psychological. For 13 months, they had owned the skies. They had fought with supreme confidence, knowing that their Zeros could dictate the terms of battle. But in the space of 10 minutes, that confidence cracked. Suddenly, every Japanese pilot in the South Pacific had to glance upward, scanning the sunlit sky, knowing that death could plummet down at speeds they could not match. When the survivors limped back to base that day, their reports were confused, even panicked. They described planes with impossible speed, guns that could kill from incredible distances, and engines that seemed immune to altitude. Commanders listened with disbelief at first. How could a twin-tailed heavy fighter outfly their elegant Zeros? But the wreckage in the jungle told the truth. The laughter that had greeted those strange American planes was gone. In its place was silence, and the growing fear that the Empire's aerial supremacy had just met its first true challenger. When the smoke cleared over New Guinea that morning, the American pilots didn't just win a fight. They proved a new kind of arithmetic ruled the skies. For the Japanese, the zero had always been measured in proud numbers: a turning radius of just 950 feet, a climb rate of 6,000 feet in under 8 minutes, a top speed of 331 miles per hour. On paper, these figures had made the zero king of the Pacific, and for over a year, those numbers translated into victory after victory. But the P-38 Lightning rewrote the equation. Two Allison V1710 engines, each producing 1,150 horsepower. Turbo superchargers that kept those engines breathing strong at altitudes where the zero choked. A maximum speed of 414 miles per hour, more than 80 miles per hour faster than the zero. A service ceiling of 44,000 feet, far beyond the reach of Japanese fighters. And perhaps most devastating of all, its concentrated nose-mounted firepower, 450 caliber Browning machine guns plus a 20mm cannon, all firing straight ahead, with no need for convergence. To a pilot like Richard Bong, these weren't just numbers, they were lifelines. They meant he could dive faster than any zero, shoot from farther away, and climb back into safety before an enemy could react. That morning, Bong saw the proof with his own eyes. Zeros that tried to follow him into a dive shook apart, their wings groaning under the stress, while his Lightning sliced smoothly through the sky. The Japanese pilots, used to fighting at close quarters, suddenly found themselves being picked off from distances they had never imagined. A Zero's 7.7mm machine guns were deadly only within a few hundred yards. The Lightning's heavy guns could kill at twice that range. By the time the Japanese saw the tracers, it was already too late. One Japanese after-action report captured the disbelief. These enemy planes strike us from impossible distances, at impossible speeds. They vanish before we can even turn. The numbers also told a story of endurance. A Zero carried just over 120 gallons of fuel. The Lightning carried more than 300, with drop tanks that extended its range past 100 miles. That meant American pilots could stay aloft longer, escort bombers farther, and still have the power to fight on the return trip. And while the Zero was a marvel of light construction, stripped of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to save weight, the P-38 was built to survive. Pilots began to notice that their planes could take hits that would have torn a Zero to pieces. Stories circulated of Lightnings limping back with shredded wings, engines smoking, even whole sections of tail shot away, yet still making it home. The contrast was devastating. Japanese airmen, who once sneered at heavy American machines, now realized those machines could dive faster, climb higher, shoot farther, and fly longer. Their Zero was still graceful, still deadly in a turn, but the battlefield itself had shifted. It was no longer a flat, horizontal contest of circles. It had become vertical, three-dimensional, ruled by altitude and velocity. That was the cruel math of superiority. And for the first time in the Pacific War, the numbers were on America's side. Richard Bong's hands were steady on the controls, but his heart hammered in his chest. A farm kid from northern Wisconsin, he had dreamed of flight since boyhood. Now, over the steaming jungles of New Guinea, he was about to learn what it truly meant to fight for his life. As the Japanese formation scattered under the Lightning attack, Bong spotted his chance. A Zero broke away from the melee, angling in on Captain Lynch's P-38. Bong pushed his throttles forward and rolled into position. He remembered his training. Don't turn with them, don't hesitate, strike once, strike true. His guns roared. Tracers reached out across the sky, slamming into the Zero's fuselage. In an instant, the Japanese fighter blossomed into a ball of fire, spinning downward toward the jungle below. Bong blinked, stunned. It was his first kill. A moment ago, he had been a rookie with no combat experience. Now, he had just shot down one of Japan's vaunted Zeros. But there was no time to celebrate. Out of the corner of his eye, Bong saw 3 more Zeros converging on his tail. His instincts screamed to twist and turn, but his mind held fast to the lessons drilled into him. Don't fight their fight. He shoved the throttles forward. The Lightning surged, diving away with raw power. The speedometer needle climbed past 450 miles per hour. Bong felt the plane shake, the controls stiff but still solid. Behind him, the pursuing Zeros tried to follow and paid the price. Their wings trembled violently, the thin airframes nearing collapse. One pilot broke off, another stalled out, and the third pulled back in frustration. The Lightning had simply outclassed them. Leveling out just above the jungle canopy, Bong caught sight of a Japanese dive bomber climbing away after its attack run. He lined up carefully, squeezed the trigger, and his guns found their mark. The bomber erupted in flames, plunging into the trees below. 2 kills in one mission. For most pilots, that would be a good day. For Richard Bong, it was the first step on a path that would see him credited with 40 confirmed victories, the highest-scoring American ace of World War II. Back at Loki Airfield, mechanics and pilots crowded around as Bong climbed from his cockpit. His flight suit was soaked with sweat, his face streaked with grime, but there was a quiet smile on his lips. He had done it. He had proven himself, and more importantly, proven the Lightning's worth. In letters home, Bong would later downplay his achievements, writing in his modest, Midwestern way about a couple of victories. But to the men around him, the significance was clear. A farm boy from Wisconsin, flying America's strange, twin-tailed fighter, had just shown the Japanese that the age of the Zero was ending. For Bong, it was the beginning of a legend. For Japan, it was the first crack in a wall that had seemed unbreakable. At Rabaul, the Japanese stronghold on New Britain, reports from the New Guinea front arrived like cold water splashed in the face of command. Pilots who had always returned with stories of dominance now staggered back, shaken, their voices tight, their words uncertain. One squadron leader described the strange American fighters as monsters from the clouds. Another admitted, almost in a whisper, that his men could not match their speed. For the first time in over a year of war, the proud aviators of the Imperial Navy spoke of fear. The accounts seemed unbelievable. Twin-tailed planes diving at impossible speeds, guns that ripped through bombers from twice the expected distance, engines that roared even at altitudes where the Zero gasped for air. To Japanese intelligence officers, the reports sounded like exaggerations born of panic. But the casualty lists told the truth. Entire bomber formations had been lost. Escorts that once turned battles into easy victories had been scattered, shot down, or forced to flee. The men who had mocked the clumsy American machines only hours earlier now spoke of them as predators, striking from above, vanishing, and then returning to kill again. For the Japanese Air Service, this was more than just a tactical setback. It was a psychological earthquake. Their doctrine had always relied on the Zero's agility, on outturning and outmaneuvering their enemies in close combat. Now they faced opponents who refused to play that game. The battlefield had gone vertical, and in that new dimension, their cherished Zero was helpless. A diary later recovered from a Japanese lieutenant captured the moment of realization. We thought ourselves hawks circling above helpless prey. Today, we learned what it is to be hunted. These new enemy planes strike with such speed that our wings tremble and our hearts collapse. In the officers' mess at Rabaul, silence replaced the usual laughter. Maps were studied, tactics debated, but no easy answers emerged. The enemy's strange fighter was not only fast, it was arriving in growing numbers. For a nation already stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean, the thought of America producing these machines in quantity was chilling. For the first time, the Empire's best pilots glimpsed the possibility that their mastery of the skies was ending. Their confidence, built over years of victory, had been punctured in a single day by a farm boy from Wisconsin and a machine born in a California factory. The laughter had died. In its place grew a gnawing realization. The balance of power in the Pacific was shifting, and Japan was no longer untouchable. Back in the United States, thousands of miles from the steaming jungles of New Guinea, America's factories were already humming day and night. The Lockheed plant in Burbank, California, sprawled across acres of concrete, its assembly lines stretching longer than football fields. Here, the P-38 Lightning was not just being built, it was being mass-produced. By early 1943, new squadrons across the Pacific were receiving the twin-tailed fighter in numbers large enough to matter. Liberty ships carried them across the ocean in crates, parts carefully padded and catalogued, ready to be reassembled on island airstrips carved out of coral and jungle. For the ground crews and pilots waiting at dusty forward bases, the arrival of a Lightning shipment felt like Christmas morning. Mechanics unpacked the crates with grease-stained hands, bolting wings to fuselages, wiring engines, checking instruments. Within days, another squadron was combat-ready. This speed of delivery told its own story. America had learned how to harness industry on a scale no other nation could match. Lockheed wasn't working alone. Companies across the country produced parts. Propellers from Hamilton Standard, radios from RCA, turbo superchargers from General Electric. The P-38 wasn't just a fighter, it was the product of an entire nation's workforce. Inside those factories were faces that told another side of the story. Women in overalls driving rivets into Lightning wings. Teenagers working night shifts, measuring parts with calipers. Immigrant machinists who barely spoke English, turning out precision components that fit perfectly into an aircraft destined for New Guinea. They listened to swing music on radios at their workbenches, drank Coca-Cola from vending machines, and read letters from sons and brothers serving overseas. Every P-38 that rolled off the line carried a little piece of that America with it. And every time one roared into battle, pilots like Richard Bong showed what it could do. In the South Pacific, the effect was immediate. Japanese pilots, who thought they had seen a rare anomaly, now discovered Lightning squadrons appearing in greater numbers every month. What had seemed like an isolated shock was becoming a pattern. Wherever the P-38 appeared, it changed the balance of the fight. Captain Thomas Lynch wrote in his diary, "For the first time, we feel like the hunters. The zero still turns tighter, but now we decide when and how to fight." That was the key difference: choice. American pilots no longer went into battle hoping to survive against superior planes. With the Lightning, they had the initiative. They could climb above, strike hard, and leave when they pleased. The Japanese began to realize that their nightmare wasn't just one machine. It was a wave, an endless wave, supported by factories and workers half a world away, who could build faster than the Empire could shoot them down. And the wave was only beginning to crest. For Japan's fighter pilots, the first encounters with the P-38 Lightning were a shock. But by early 1943, shock gave way to desperate adaptation. Squadron leaders at Rabaul and Truk gathered their men, sketching diagrams on chalkboards, revising tactics, and issuing new orders. The message was simple: do not chase the twin-tailed fighter into a dive. The Zero, with its lightweight frame and unmatched agility, had been built for the horizontal fight. Its pilots were masters of the slow, turning duel, where skill and instinct decided the outcome. But the Lightning refused to fight that way. It dove, struck at blistering speed, then climbed back into the clouds. Commanders urged their men to lure the P-38s into turning battles, to drag them down into the Zero's arena. Some tried, but more often, the Americans refused the bait. They had learned the lesson well: fight on their terms, and you died. One Japanese ace confided in his diary, "We circle and circle, but they do not follow. They strike and vanish. We are left grasping at the empty sky." Even the most experienced pilots struggled. Veterans who had fought over China and Pearl Harbor admitted privately that the new American fighter had stolen their initiative. The Zero could not climb with it. It could not dive with it. Its range advantage was shrinking as the P-38s carried drop tanks farther into contested skies. And worst of all, Japan's pool of veterans was thinning. Each time a Lightning squadron struck, another handful of irreplaceable pilots failed to return. The Empire could build more Zeros, but it could not replace the years of experience lost in a single mission. Meanwhile, the Americans were training more pilots every month, feeding them into the Pacific with machines that were fast, durable, and forgiving. Where Japan relied on a dwindling cadre of elite flyers, the United States built an air force of depth, hundreds of men learning the same doctrine: don't turn, strike fast, use the climb. Stories spread through Japanese units of entire formations breaking apart under lightning attacks. Some younger pilots flying their first missions admitted their fear openly, others never returned at all. By mid-1943, a chilling phrase began circulating among the Imperial pilots: "The sky belongs to the twin tails." It was more than just a battlefield adjustment, it was a confession. The Zero was no longer the undisputed ruler of the Pacific, and no matter how they tried to adapt, the Lightning always seemed to hold the advantage. For the Japanese, the choice was brutal: adapt or die. But each battle showed that even adaptation had its limits. Doctrine, design, and industry were all conspiring against them. For America, it was the opposite story. Each new pilot who strapped into a Lightning carried the confidence of a nation that could outbuild, outtrain, and outfight its enemies. The tide of the Pacific Air War was turning, and the farm boy from Wisconsin, Richard Bong, was right in the middle of it. While Richard Bong and his fellow pilots fought in the skies above New Guinea, half a world away in California, the source of their strength never slept. The Lockheed factory in Burbank looked more like a city than a plant. By 1943, more than 90,000 workers streamed through its gates in 3 shifts, around the clock. Inside, assembly lines stretched longer than Main Street in a small town. Wings, engines, fuselages, and tails moved steadily along until they emerged as completed P-38 Lightnings, gleaming silver under fluorescent lights. But the true miracle wasn't just the scale, it was the people. Housewives who only months before had worried about grocery lists now drove rivets into aluminum skins. Teenagers too young to vote measured parts with calipers. Retired machinists came back to work, determined to give the boys overseas every advantage. Many of the men were off fighting, so women made up nearly half the workforce. They wore overalls, tied their hair in scarves, and quickly proved as skilled and efficient as anyone. One young worker, Rose Will Monroe, became famous as Rosie the Riveter, driving thousands of rivets into P-38s with a pneumatic gun, her accuracy so precise that defect rates fell. She was just one of many, but together they became the backbone of American air power. Every Lightning that rolled off the line carried a little bit of this America with it. The swing music echoing from radios on the factory floor, the Coca-Cola bottles clinking in lunchrooms, the scribbled notes workers sometimes tucked inside panels, messages of encouragement for pilots they would never meet. The technical brilliance of the Lightning was another part of the story. Its turbo superchargers, built by General Electric, allowed the engines to breathe at altitudes where others suffocated. Its radios, produced by RCA, let pilots coordinate attacks across miles of sky. Every P-38 was the product of a vast network: propellers from Connecticut, aluminum from Tennessee, instruments from Ohio. No other nation could match it. Japan, stretched thin across 1,000 islands, struggled to replace even the planes it lost each month. America, by contrast, could lose a dozen Lightnings in a single week and replace them in days. To the Japanese pilots who faced them, the twin tails were terrifying enough. But the true horror was the realization that these machines would keep coming, endlessly, relentlessly, because behind them stood a nation whose factories were stronger than any fortress. For America, the P-38 wasn't just a fighter plane. It was a symbol of democracy's power to mobilize, innovate, and endure. It represented not just a pilot like Richard Bong, but the farmer who grew the wheat, the woman who riveted the wing, the engineer who designed the turbocharger. It was the proof that war was no longer won only by skill in the cockpit. It was won by the ability of a free people to outbuild and outthink their enemies. And as more P-38s streamed into the Pacific, that truth became impossible to ignore. On that December morning in 1942, when the Japanese first laid eyes on the strange, twin-tailed American fighters, they laughed. To them, the P-38 looked ungainly, too heavy, too awkward, too slow to ever threaten the graceful Zero. But by the end of that day, the laughter was gone. The skies above New Guinea had revealed a brutal truth. Agility alone no longer ruled the air. The battlefield had shifted into a vertical dimension where speed, altitude, and firepower mattered more than tight turns. In that new world, the Zero was suddenly outmatched, and the Lightning stood supreme. For Richard Bong, that day was the beginning of a journey that would make him America's top ace. 40 confirmed victories later, the farm boy from Wisconsin became a symbol in his own right, not just of courage, but of what America could achieve when its people and its industry worked together. He flew with modesty, wrote home like any son, and carried the hopes of a nation in every mission. For Japan, the experience was devastating. Pilots who once circled with arrogance now returned shaken, describing machines that could dive faster, shoot farther, and climb higher than anything they had ever faced. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, had met its match. But the story of the P-38 was bigger than any single dogfight. It was the story of a nation that had turned factories into fortresses and workers into warriors. Every Lightning that rolled off Lockheed's assembly lines carried with it the strength of democracy, the idea that free people, united, could outthink and outbuild the dictatorships of the world. Years later, a Japanese pilot who had survived those early encounters admitted quietly, "We thought the Zero would rule forever." Then came the Lightning. The laughter that had echoed over the Pacific skies in 1942 was gone for good. In its place was awe, fear, and respect. The P-38 had proven not only that America could fight, but that America could lead the future of aerial warfare. And for the men who flew them, like Richard Bong, the Lightning wasn't just an airplane. It was the wings of a nation, carrying them to victory. History isn't just about battles, it's about the people, the choices, and the turning points that shaped our world. What do you think? Could the P-38 have been the true game-changer of the Pacific? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe these untold stories deserve to be remembered, hit that like button, subscribe, and join me for the next chapter of World War II history, where another forgotten moment will come to life.